I watched everything Sarah and I built reduce to dust while the woman who caused it all smiled like she was checking items off a grocery list. The roar of diesel engines drowned out everything except the pounding in my chest. The smell of sawdust mixed with morning mist, and as splinters rained down, I realized my dream home, the one I built for my dying wife, was being demolished over less than $900 in fake HOA fees. And the woman behind it all, the HOA president, thought she'd finally beaten me. What she didn't know was that she had just destroyed a house on land she didn't even own. Because every inch of this valley belonged to me. 3 years earlier, my life had felt almost perfect. My name's Marcus Blackwood, and at 48 I thought I'd finally earned peace. I'd sold my software company for $40 million and wanted nothing more than to spend my remaining years with my wife, Sarah, who was fighting stage 4 pancreatic cancer. We found a quiet piece of heaven in Willowbrook Valley, Colorado, 847 acres of pristine wilderness wrapped around a crystal-clear lake. It was the kind of place where the air tasted clean and the world felt still, like time itself slowed down for you. Sarah fell in love with the view instantly. She used to sit in her wheelchair at the construction site wrapped in a blanket, watching the workers hammer and saw with that fierce spark in her eyes that even cancer couldn't dim. She said the smell of pine lumber was her favorite perfume. She'd close her eyes and tell me she could already hear laughter echoing off the lake from family dinners we'd never get to have. 3 months before the house was finished, she was gone. I carried her ashes into that mansion the day I moved in. The house stood like a glass and timber monument to everything we'd dreamed of. 6,200 square feet overlooking sunrise on the water. Every board, every nail carried a memory of her. My kids, Connor and Riley, visited often at first. They tried to fill the silence, but the grief sat heavy, thick enough to taste in the air. Still, that home felt like the last place Sarah ever smiled, and I promised myself I'd protect it. I didn't know then that I was moving into a battlefield. The community looked perfect from the outside. 34 luxury homes surrounded by forest, quiet roads, and manicured lawns. It was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, it was ruled by a woman who believed power made her untouchable. Her name was Deborah Whitmore, 58 years old, always dressed like she was about to host a board meeting. The first time she came to my door, clipboard in hand, her smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Your dock extends 12 inches beyond approved specs," she said, like she was delivering a death sentence. "That's a $150 violation." I told her the dock had been pre-approved by the previous board. She smiled wider, the way predators do before they strike. "Previous approvals don't supersede current standards. I'm the president now." 2 weeks later, that $150 fine had somehow grown to $847, labeled an attitude adjustment fee because I'd asked for written clarification. I laughed at first, thinking it was some bureaucratic mistake. I wasn't laughing long. The neighbors started talking quietly once they realized I was next on her list. Tom Chen whispered that Deborah had driven his elderly parents out of the valley by fining them over their medical oxygen machine, claiming it violated community aesthetics. Maria Santos showed me photos of obvious violations on homes owned by Deborah's friends: illegal fences, unlicensed renovations, cluttered lawns, all ignored. And Florence Pike, an 82-year-old widow, cried as she told me Deborah had forced her to tear down her late husband's memorial rose garden because it wasn't architecturally consistent. That's when I realized this wasn't about property values, it was control. She targeted newcomers and anyone who questioned her. I just didn't know yet that she'd been doing it for years, systematically destroying families who couldn't fight back. The Hendersons had sold their home for nearly $300,000 below market value after she buried them in fake violations. I was about to be her next example. 2 days later, I got a call from my bank that made my stomach drop. "Mr. Blackwood, there's been a lien placed on your property for unpaid HOA fees." I almost dropped the phone. I hadn't even missed a single payment. Turns out Deborah had called an emergency HOA meeting while I was out of town visiting my daughter. Only her inner circle attended. They voted to authorize the lien in my absence. No notice, no quorum, no legality. But it didn't stop her from sending official paperwork to my bank and freezing my account. Then she published a community newsletter hinting at an uncooperative homeowner who disrespected community standards. No name mentioned, but everyone knew who she meant. I'd built my company fighting corporate bullies, and I could smell corruption a mile away. I called the best real estate attorney in the county, Patricia Gomez. She didn't even hesitate. "Marcus, what they did is illegal," she said. "They violated state statutes requiring 30 days written notice and proper procedure. We can crush this." That call was the start of a war Deborah didn't see coming. Within 48 hours, Patricia had filed for a full audit of the HOA's finances. I had security cameras installed all over my property, just in case, because I knew people like Deborah never stopped at paperwork. I was right. The next morning I noticed unfamiliar cars driving slowly past my gate. Black sedans, tinted windows moving just slow enough to make me uncomfortable. I'd fought corporate espionage before, and I knew intimidation when I saw it. I didn't just plan to defend myself. I planned to burn her little empire to the ground. The valley was quiet that night, the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. I stood on my dock staring across the water and thought of Sarah's words from the hospital. "Protect this place. Make sure it stays beautiful." I had no idea how ugly it was about to get. The first time Deborah tried to get under my skin, she thought a few anonymous notices and a pile of paperwork would do it. She didn't know she had picked a man who knew how to build an army from fragments. What started as a legal dispute became a quiet revolution. Tom Chen slid a folded note under my door one damp morning, "Coffee at 7, Lakeside Diner," and within days a small, ragged band of neighbors was meeting in kitchens and garages, trading stories like contraband. Each tale stitched together a pattern: selective enforcement, phony fines, inspections scheduled when targeted homeowners were out of town. The evidence piled up not because I demanded it, but because the victims had been waiting for someone to listen. Once we started listening, they kept talking until the truth was impossible to ignore. Riley was the spearhead. She drove up from Denver with a backpack full of subpoenas and a glare that could cut through forged signatures. Her environmental law training translated into a knack for finding connections, payments, permits, and the odd little invoices that never added up. Connor mapped property lines and photographed renovations. His camera caught things Deborah's inner circle had assumed would stay private. Patricia brought the kind of legal focus that made judges sit up straighter. We stopped treating this as neighborly squabbling and started treating it like a criminal investigation. Every receipt, every invoice, every whispered phone call was cataloged, time-stamped, and cross-referenced until the HOA's books looked less like financial records and more like evidence for indictment. And then we found the pattern of theft, a string of community projects that mysteriously aligned with high-end upgrades to Deborah's own house. A dubious $15,000 for entrance gate maintenance that matched the wrought iron fence suddenly encircling her property. Landscape consulting fees filed at the same time her yard suddenly bloomed with professional irrigation. Legal fees paid to a firm that existed only as a UPS mailbox. It read like a confessional written in accounting software, and the admission was loud enough for any prosecutor to hear. When Patricia pushed for a forensic audit, the accountant she hired laughed, until the figures started to line up. Then the laughter stopped. The Community Intelligence Network moved from coffee shop whispers to full-on operational planning. Maria organized photos and phone logs. Florence kept a handwritten ledger of Deborah's inspection schedule with the meticulous hand of a court stenographer. Tom held barbecue war room strategy sessions where neighbors shared everything from incriminating voicemail recordings to CCTV footage of midnight inspections. Even the quietest homeowners, those who had been cowed into silence by 8 years of pressure, stepped forward. With each testimony, the case stopped feeling theoretical and started feeling inevitable. Deborah's carefully curated image of competence began to crumble under the weight of real-world proof. Deborah responded the only way a cornered bully could. She escalated. What began as petty harassment metamorphosed into a campaign of sabotage. Cameras were disabled by utility crews with no logos and no paperwork. Tires were slashed in grocery store lots. Social media smear accounts sprang up overnight, painting me as a grief-stricken paranoiac who'd turned his private mourning into public menace. She filed a restraining order claiming I was stalking her, turned my legitimate security measures into criminal voyeurism, and tried to weaponize the legal system against the very people she'd victimized for years. It was cheap theater, except when it worked. People are quick to believe simple narratives, and Deborah banked on that. But every move she made left traces. The fake utility crew cut camera wires with hands that shook. One of them failed to wipe his phone properly and left a breadcrumb in an upload folder Connor found. A smear account used images scraped from my security feeds, but metadata didn't lie. The timestamps were wrong, and the source traced back to a public computer in a neighboring town where Deborah's brother's contracting company kept a P.O. box. Florence's notebook contained dates and times of inspections that matched perfectly with anonymous notices she'd mailed days earlier. It was sloppy, panicked work. The more she pushed, the more mistakes she made. Our strategy became simple. Let Deborah reveal herself. We would not confront with bluster. We would let evidence do the talking. Riley's whistleblower reports to federal agencies were surgical. Patricia's motions in state court applied pressure. Connor and Maria fed the media narrative with airtight documentation and video that left little room for spin. We were patient, and patience matters when you're facing someone who trades in fear. Deborah thought time was on her side. She had used it to grind people down for years. But time is a double-edged sword. It lets secrets rot, and once they rot, they smell. Ours reeked of embezzlement and collusion. The tipping point came when we uncovered the county inspector's involvement. Randy Fletcher, the man who had signed off on the emergency demolition paperwork, had a trail of favors and conversational breadcrumbs leading back to Deborah's ex-husband, a longtime county commissioner. The inspection that found my house unsafe had been scheduled suspiciously soon after Deborah called for an emergency remedy. Randy's tape measure and clipboard had become tools of convenience rather than instruments of justice. But even Randy wasn't invisible. Surveillance caught him lingering outside my property the week his report was filed, and an audio clip from a hidden recorder captured him muttering about getting the job done right before Deborah called. It was the connective tissue we needed to show a pattern of institutional enablement. Once federal investigators came knocking, the atmosphere shifted from tense to electric. There's a different kind of silence when a government investigator asks questions. It's colder, like winter glass. The burden of secrecy shifted onto Deborah, and she didn't handle it well. She began to make bigger mistakes. Orders for emergency community assessments that lined up with invoices for work performed on her home, calls to contractors who would later testify they'd been paid by HOA funds to perform private upgrades, and a streak of arrogance that believed money could buy discretion. Each act fed the narrative Patricia was building in court, and the whistleblowers were confirming in federal channels. All the while, we fortified our legal defenses. Injunctions froze foreclosure attempts, and countersuits exposed the frivolous nature of Deborah's litigation. Patricia's filings were surgical: procedural errors, lack of quorum for emergency meetings, failure to provide required notices. All the little things that can sink a corrupt regime. At night, I would sit at my kitchen table surrounded by blueprints, spreadsheets, and dozens of printed emails, and feel something I hadn't let myself feel in months: hope. Not the bright, naive kind, but the kind that comes from systems being pushed to reveal their true nature. And then Deborah went nuclear. The morning my house was demolished, the whole valley heard diesel engines before anything else. She'd secured a county demolition order and rallied deputies to ensure compliance, timing it for maximum humiliation on the morning of the big HOA meeting. She wanted spectacle, public ruin as performance art. She imagined cameras focused on her triumphant smile as a symbol of her power. What she didn't realize was that our cameras were already rolling, that federal marshals were on their way, and that every face in her inner circle had been cataloged and cross-referenced. As the hydraulic arms began to tear through beams and windows, as splinters flew like shaken snow, her victory parade transformed into the final act of a play whose ending she had written for herself. By the time the dust settled, the stage was set for the kind of reckoning she'd never planned for. Evidence assembled quietly and relentlessly had the weight of law behind it. The neighbors who'd once whispered in kitchens now sat together in courtrooms and testified. The smugness in Deborah's smile was replaced with the handcuffs that would come for her. The war had been long, but it had been necessary. We didn't seek revenge for the sake of it. We sought justice, and when the system aligned with truth, it delivered. Engines roared as demolition crews tore through my home, the same one Sarah and I had built with love and loss. Deborah stood nearby, clipboard in hand, smiling as the walls came down. She thought she'd finally won. What she didn't know was that every second of her crime was being live-streamed to the world, and the land she stood on was mine. Federal agents were already on their way, summoned by Riley's environmental report about illegal demolition near a protected lake. Patricia had alerted the press. Connor's hidden cameras captured every smirk on Deborah's face. The moment the last wall fell, sirens echoed through the valley. The EPA trucks rolled in, and Deborah's perfect smile started to crack. That evening's HOA meeting turned into her public downfall. She strutted to the podium, boasting about her emergency demolition. I stood from the back row, a folder in hand. "Before you continue," I said, "you should all know something." Connor dimmed the lights, revealing official county deeds. "Through Blackwood Holdings LLC, I announced, I own every acre of this valley. Every home here, including yours, Deborah, sits on my land." The room gasped. Deborah went pale. "You destroyed a house on land you don't own," I continued. "You falsified records, stole HOA funds, and broke federal laws, and every bit of it is on camera." Riley stepped forward. "The EPA has launched a criminal investigation," she said firmly. Patricia followed. "And the Attorney General has filed fraud and racketeering charges." The doors burst open. Federal marshals entered. "Deborah Whitmore," one announced, "you're under arrest." The click of handcuffs was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Months later, Willowbrook Valley was reborn. The corrupt HOA was dissolved and replaced by the Willowbrook Community Trust, transparent, fair, and resident-led. Deborah's stolen funds rebuilt homes and repaid victims. Florence's rose garden bloomed again. Maria became the community's ombudsman. I rebuilt my house on the same ground where she'd destroyed it, now powered by solar and peace. Every sunrise over the lake feels like Sarah's blessing, a promise kept. Deborah thought she could break me, but she built something stronger instead. A community that finally learned what real power looks like. People standing together for what's right.